Welcome to the best Drupal is no Drupal. We're going to talk about using WordPress. I'm just kidding. This is static site generation with Tome and Microservices. This is primarily about using the Tome module to turn Drupal content into a static site. This will be sort of equal parts sales pitch for Tome and retrospective on a pretty large-scale project that my team worked on in order to do this. That will hopefully give you some insight. Spacebar is supposed to work. Who am I? This is all of my worldly accomplishments. My name is Jacob Yeager, 39. I've worked for Mabomo for a little over 8 years, done a bunch of stuff. Really the most important thing here is I really wish I could use Python more often. It's wonderful, but PHP is fine. Currently working at the GSA and have done plenty in front-end, back-end DevOps. Started out at my university as a spell checker for the website, learned PHP on the job. I'm sort of self-taught, and now I get to speak at the most prestigious conference in the world, as all of you know. What are we going to talk about today? I'm going to give you sort of an introduction to what Tome is, in case you don't know. And then I'll give sort of an overview of how we set up Tome and what our site is like for context. And then we'll spend the majority of our time talking about some problems that we faced and some ways in which that Tome can be utilized, as well as issues that we run into. And then give a quick update from where we are now. Then you can use that information and profit, you know. And if you don't get the South Park reference, it's because I'm old. All right, what is Tome? Tome is a module for converting Drupal content into static assets. It can both convert and store, though on our project we'll talk primarily about the conversion project because we actually have a lot of custom implementation for storage. A lot of the benefits are that it doesn't have any JavaScript requirements. It's PHP only. It makes heavy usage of Drupal caching and its own internal caching systems. And its big takeaway is that it has views, pager, and OEmbed built in. So it works right out of the box. Of course, if you do custom implementations like we've done, it breaks and you have to fix it, which is what we'll talk about in a little bit later. So why would you want to use Tome? Why? In this case, I went to college, and so I know how to alliterate. So security, speed, sturdiness, and scaling would be the reasons I would put. For security, since basically the end users never interact with your backend. When you have Drupal as your CMS in some secure location, you build your static assets, and you put them on your front-end production server somewhere. And since the front-facing server only contains HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and any packages that are required to support those, if any bad actors get into that service, the worst thing that they can do is deface your site, and then Tome will overwrite it in 10 minutes whenever you have it set up to run again. And since there's no database queries and no dynamic code execution permitted, because you can turn all of that off, it leaves a lot of attack vectors sealed off. A great way to get out of basic stuff, especially like SQL injection, because there is none. There's complete separation between the CMS and production environments, which, as I mentioned, gets rid of SQL injection, PHP code execution, and just basically no real connection there. It's also a lot faster in terms of speed, since you're just serving up standard HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it also works really well with Drupal's caching, because it still uses the compressed CSS and JavaScript. Everything moves really quickly. And you can use it with services like Redis or Memcached and CDNs, like CloudFront and Cloudflare. It's also really sturdy. If your CMS goes down, which it has done for us on multiple occasions, because we all make errors and mistakes, your production site continues to run. You don't have any downtime for your end users. It's also cheap and easy to add additional instances because the memory and storage demands are quite low. And there's no database dependencies, and so you're not having to run into concurrent queries or anything along those lines. You can also version control all of these static assets as well. We have a pretty robust system on our site for backup and restoration in the case of failure or compromise of some kind. And so it tends to be pretty strong and stable, especially once you get it really well set up. And then lastly, scaling. The data transfer speeds are really fast, and so your deployments tend to go really quickly. There's no back-end processing. And then, as mentioned, you can easily get it to move globally. It goes very quickly through CDN pipelines, and so changes happen really quickly. And on top of that, it also has a really high potential for horizontal scaling, because of the resource costs being so low. For us, we moved to Tome for a myriad of reasons, though the primary story of it is we used to have a system that was called Mothership that was our own sort of proprietary static site generator. That primarily what it did is it scraped the Drupal site and then built our site afterward. And so we would have to use content that was built in Drupal in sort of like small reusable pieces, and then build it on the fly afterward using our generator. The problem with that presented, one, was it was somewhat unstable. Two, it meant that our content editors, when they built stuff, they never actually saw the rendered page as they were building it. And so they would write content, and then when they saved it, they would see their little blurb, their body copy or whatever they did, but they wouldn't actually see what it looked like. And so that ran into issues if they ever wanted to do something custom or special or anything like that. They would end up in situations where we have to go back and forth quite often. So the major reason why we ended up choosing Tome, even though there was some issues that we'll get into later, is that it has, sort of out of the box, a pretty deep understanding of Drupal. It understands nodes, taxonomies, views, has built-in integration with Drupal's rendering system and caching, has much higher SEO performance. We were really struggling with that in our old system. And it's maintained by the Drupal community. It's currently in a minimally maintained status, but we've even pushed stuff back up the chain, and it's been added to the main module upstream. So it is still being maintained. We'll do a quick overview of our setup. Currently, we're doing it with a metric ton of shell scripting, though we do have plans to start moving to Terraform toward the end of this year and into 2026. We have a pretty standard development workflow: feature branches into dev into stage into prod, all that stuff. Every commit creates a Circle CI job that allows us to deploy a CMS, which is where we hold Drupal, a www site, which is where we hold our static assets, and a WAF, and a bunch of other services that matter a lot to us and don't matter to you. For Tome specifically, we have so in all my practice, I keep messing this part up. Once we deploy, it always generates a new site, no matter what. So the static files always get regenerated at that point. Once we've deployed, and that's happened, we have a cron job that runs every minute, and it goes through a very simple process. It checks to whether or not Tome is running. If it's not, it runs Tome, and it checks to see if Tome needs to run, which basically it checks for content updates, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, and then it runs. And we also have a force flag, so we can tell it to run if we need it to for some reason. So this is a very redacted version of our site architecture. We're standard cloud.gov, Drupal 10 instance, MariaDB for content storage, S3FS, using S3, Redis, all the standard stuff. If you want to take a picture, you're welcome to. I have made sure that nothing proprietary is available, so feel free. And then we're using a bunch of custom modules, which is what we're going to get into when we talk about problems for static site generation enhancements. Specifically for Tome, what we're doing every 30 minutes, so basically we're looking across all of the data in the Drupal database the last 30 minutes of looking for node, block, and taxonomy changes. We're looking for container updates, which have bit us in the butt many times, and then for the force flag that we have available to us. And then we have a bunch of post-processing pipeline items that we do after Tome is run, which is asset copying. Because while normally, if you just set up a Drupal instance, a standard one, without any changes, and then installed Tome on it, you would get basically all of these things, fonts, images, and themes, sort of on its own. But when you do as much custom craziness as we have done, you end up having to account for that. So we copy over fonts and images and themes that are not handled by Tome normally. We do some additional syncing for the S3 bucket, and also taking out extra PHP files that we don't need. We do some analytics integrations. One of the things that we also need to do is, since we maintain because we have actually kind of two sets of end users. We have our content editors, which is an end user for our product, and then we have the public, which is sort of the end user for the static site. We do some URL rewriting on all of the static assets so that our URLs that are internal to the CMS, which would be like CMS blah blah blah, gets transformed into www. It's hard to say fast. And then we're also using the sitemap module, and so we need to remove a bunch of stuff for that that's from development-specific things. And lastly, we have a lot of logging and monitoring that we take care of, where we keep track of what's going on in Tome. We keep those things in S3. And we have a pretty robust set of scripts that take care of checking to see whether or not the generation is completed properly. Because the last thing that you want to happen is a half-completed static site, having memories, deployed to, thankfully not production in our case, but it could happen, so you don't want that. All right, so that's kind of how we have everything set up. What kind of problems do we run into? Tome genuinely runs largely really easily out of the box, but when you do custom things, you end up running into some really interesting problems. So we have on our site, the vast majority of the pages on our site have both English and Spanish versions. And our Spanish version, the way that we do it is we use sort of a /es/ whatever the URL would be in English. Well, of course, the URL often gets translated into Spanish, but the /es part is the part that's important. And what we started finding is that when we regenerated our static site, we would get, especially on the Spanish homepage, it would redirect back to itself. And so you'd go to /es to get to the homepage, and you would just get a redirect loop until it crashed. And we did a bunch of investigation. This was several months, if I remember correctly. And what it turned out was that the way that Tome worked is that since internally, Drupal, if you have a URL that ends without a trailing slash, it will also take that same URL that has a trailing slash and create a redirect to the one without. And so if you do /es/, it'll redirect you to /es. It's just what Drupal does. And what Tome was doing was it would generate the correct page because it would find /es. Then later, in its sort of collecting of URLs process, it would find /es/ and say, oh, this is that same thing. What is it? Oh, it's a redirect. Let me overwrite that original page that I generated earlier with this redirect. And so it would circle through. And so what we ended up doing in order to correct this is we did a couple of things. We sort of overcorrected on purpose. The first thing we did was we overrode the path placeholder event class in order to prevent the export of trailing slashes at all. So anytime there was a trailing slash, we basically ignored Drupal's internal redirection, and we implemented it on the Nginx side. And so we did basically Drupal's job on the static side part. And then we did some path tracking where we kept track of pages that were already generated to avoid duplication. We also did some extra work. Actually, this is actually somewhat of a mistake at the time. We thought that actually part of the problem was that we were getting bad URLs. And so we started to implement some stuff that would sort of detect whether or not URLs were problematic. And then we kept it because it's a good idea. You don't really want bad URLs getting generated. And then we we proactively found some stuff in the future that could in the future cause problems, and also excluded them. So it was a pretty hairy problem for quite a long time, but it just goes to show like some of the way the internal processing can get in the way. The last two are really interconnected, but we'll talk about performance first. The first thing that we found, one of the major things we found pretty early with Tome, and actually one of the reasons why it wasn't like immediately adopted, and when we were evaluating different tools, is that its performance was, for us at first at least, quite bad. It took almost 2 hours the first few times we were running it to get a static site. To get a new static site. And we went through a lot of the huge, like it would take actually way too much to try to explain all of the things we went through trying to figure out what to do. But we ended up nailing it down to sort of 2 root causes. The first is there's a variable in Tome called path count. And basically what path count is how many pages get generated every time Drupal bootstraps when it runs. And so basically what Tome does is it bootstraps Drupal, which you have to do, and then it batches up, 10 or whatever pages in order to generate. It generates them and then it kills that process and then starts again. And we, for other reasons we'll talk about in a second, couldn't increase that value. And so that was slowing us down, because what it meant is we could only generate 1 page at a time per process. And we'll talk about how we fixed that in a second. The other issue we ran into was the startup costs were really, really high. Drupal Bootstrap, as you probably are aware, is really expensive. And so it becomes really time-consuming to do that, especially if you're only doing 1 page at a time over and over again. And we had something along the lines of 1,800 nodes to go through. So what we did ultimately, and we're going to get more into this into the last problem, is we fixed the caching problems. We increased parallelism, so now we're running more processes and a higher path count. So to explain how we got to these solutions, we have to talk about the bigger problem that we ran into on top of it, which is that we were also, on top of this performance problem, getting wrong menuing. So we have a side menu that's pretty prolific across our site. That what we were finding is that when we generated a static site, we would have pages where we would get either the wrong active trail across a menu, or we would sometimes just get entirely the wrong menu from a different part of the site. And originally we tried to figure out ways to implement a solution for this through Twig templates, but eventually we realized that this was sort of a hunch from the beginning, but we couldn't prove it for a long time. We eventually concluded that it was a caching problem. And we tried a ton. I personally tried many unsuccessful implementations of trying to solve this problem. And what it came down to was that Tome is very aware of Drupal's caching on its own, and very aware of any cache tags that Drupal lets it know about. And if a module isn't designed in a way that tells Drupal to tell other modules about its cache tags, that's when you run into problems. And that's what we ran into. We essentially discovered that there were a lot of menu-specific, module-specific cache tags that were not being logged for Tome to know to bust. And so what we ultimately had to do was essentially something like this. This is somewhat mocked up. But we had to create a function that overrode this request prepare subscriber class and busted these specific caches. And what this does is every single time it creates a request, and this is for per page, not per batch, it'll bust these caches. And so we ended up in a position where these wrong menus didn't happen. It had an additional, I know I'm simplifying. Chris is on the project with me, and he's over here looking at me like, this is an oversimplification. I know it is. And so we bust these caches, and on top of that, we also get the benefit of also being able to increase our path count without having extra cache pollution, which enabled us to also have an increased speed. So to sort of sum up some of the things that we ultimately did in addition to what Tome is, and these are just sort of labeled for your benefit in terms of the class that we operated on, so that if in the future you run into issues trying to use it, you have a reference to go from. So we went in and excluded some particular paths, like /node, /JSON API, /taxonomy. This, to some degree, was for aesthetic purposes, but also because of the well-known structure of how Drupal is done, it made it easier to publish it that way. We removed trailing slashes from ES links, blocked some problematic redirect paths, and then we reset these particular caches for us. Again, this won't necessarily be for what you might do depending on your site setup, but for us, it was the alias manager, menu link storage, and route matches that are happening between requests, which allowed us to get an increase in the path count. And then one thing that wasn't really mentioned in an earlier thing, because this was something that wasn't really a problem, it was just part of a project that we did. We added a function that allowed us to convert query parameters into standard URL arguments. No, wait, am I saying that right? Did I just say it in reverse? URL arguments into parameters? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
You had it right the first time.
I had it, okay, the first time, thank you. Okay, good, trust your instincts. Because we have a custom JavaScript application that uses it's an A to Z index essentially, and so you can do lots of things like this in order to really customize Tome to your liking. So sort of our current state right now is that we've, from our sort of mothership, really long, complicated situation to early Tome where everything took 2 hours to run, we've managed to get ourselves all the way down to a 30-minute, really stable, and also really high parity output from Tome. Our deployment is super highly automated. From branch to static site is just a few clicks to a large degree. We click a couple of buttons and we wait, and that's basically all we have to do. There's almost no downtime. In fact, when we deploy, one of the coolest parts about it is that if an end user is on our static site, they see no interruption whatsoever when the site updates, because the switch between the static assets is instantaneous from their perspective. And then these static files are just a lot easier to manage and scale for a production environment. Some of our future plans, as mentioned, is we plan to switch to Terraform. That's going to be a pretty big thing. Continue to improve our logging and status tracking, and we still think that we can actually squeak more efficiency out of Tome. It's a little longer term goal as well, but that's what it is. Questions? That was a little shorter than I intended, but go for it.
How many static pages does it generate overall, and then 30 minutes or less?
Right now, we're sitting somewhere around 1900.
Any forms on the site?
There's one.
And how do you handle that?
It works out of the box. So you can do a post request. So you can make requests back to the CMS just fine. You just have to, with a standard, you just make the URL back to, especially since we're running our CMS site publicly, sort of, so to speak, as well. It's actually relatively easy to do. Yeah.
And so I wasn't familiar with Tome before.
Mm-hmm.
Just to make sure I understand, the idea is you basically want to have a static version of what your Drupal site looks like.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a one-to-one in terms of theme.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks the same.
Yeah, it does.
So does Tome support? I mean, I guess I probably answered that question by understanding the first part, but I have a situation where we've got a content hub that feeds many different front-end sites that are statically generated from that. Can Tome support something like that?
It does support It does support like the multi-Drupal sort of thing. I think it probably could.
We have like a one single Drupal instance and then many static front-end sites that look different, so they would need different.
Yeah, I think they could do multiple themes. Do you think so?
I think so, but I don't know for sure.
I don't think it's something we've tried, but I don't see why not, especially since Drupal has built into it the idea of having different themes for different pages. So I don't see why you couldn't.
And then the other question is, I don't know if I missed it. What about the case where you have like an incremental change? You go into one page and make one change. That doesn't require the full 30-minute rebuild, or do the assets get swapped in?
That's actually a very good distinction. So the way that we are currently setting our particular site up is that we do a full rebuild, but you don't have to. So there's two modules inside of Tome. One of them is called Tome Static, the other is called Tome Sync. Static is essentially the tool that it uses for the entire rebuild, and then Sync allows you to do incremental rebuilds within that static thing. And it just depends a lot on how you have it set up. It turns out for us it makes a lot more sense and is a lot simpler for us to just do a full rebuild every time. But especially since we have the ability to throw asset, we basically can throw resources at it, so it's okay. But for most people, Sync will be the way to go.
What site is this?
I'm not allowed to say. I've been explicitly told not to say, which is why I have not said so.
Okay.
It's not technically a secret, it's public, and all the information on it's public, and if you want to ask me after the session, I will gladly tell you, but I'm not actually allowed to say it, that's why I haven't said it. Go ahead.
Ask some others then. So how does it handle page URL path changes, like when a page URL is based on the title and someone changes the title, and then there's a redirect typically put in place if you're using the redirect module?
Yeah, so far as I understand, Tome and the redirect module play nicely together. And so when the static site gets regenerated, it'll create a redirect because it still reads the redirect table that Drupal generates.
So it doesn't like create a page that hosts a like HTML redirect.
It creates
actually a web server.
It hosts there's a page that has a redirect on it, is what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then where do you store? Oh, I'm sorry. Where do you store the static site?
It depends on how you want to do it. So what we do is we store it. We do it kind of a couple different ways. But we store it on. We're using Cloud Foundry, and so we have a standard web server that we're serving our static site from. Actually, one of the ways that I recommend doing it for somebody who's not sort of working under the constraints that we're on is I would say get an S3 bucket and turn it into web server mode. And it'll make your life 1,000 times easier. Though Tome does actually have some storage solutions built into it, but I haven't experimented with them, so I can't really speak to them. So,
for smaller teams, does it make sense to take this direction, or is it just for large teams with unlimited budgets?
No. In fact, I think maybe for smaller teams, it's actually probably a pretty good plan. I think the only limitation in my mind for a smaller team would be level of effort to some degree, because it is a little bit of an adjustment in how to operate. But you're actually probably going to save money on it in the long term because your production environment will cost you a ton less. And then your internal content creation environment can be really small as well, because the only people who need to be on there are the people making the content. And so it kind of provides a lot of different benefits, like smaller resource costs, as well as higher levels of security, higher levels of sturdiness and resilience. And so I actually think it's generally a good plan for small teams. I think the only major downside you're going to find is like there's a level of effort and learning curve that comes with it that might just take more time than if you had resources to throw at it.
So you mentioned that it understands nodes, taxonomies, and views. How about if your site is heavily driven by paragraphs?
Yeah, well, we have paragraphs, and it works great. So it does understand paragraphs pretty well.
Are there any gotchas with images? Does it smartly generate like just the styles for just the images that need them, or do you get like the whole set like if you click preview? Or
there are some gotchas, but it's mostly so out of the box you won't really run into any, and because it understands like the image styling, Drupal image styles and media embeds pretty well. It handles no problem. We've ended up doing a bunch of stuff that has required us to take some steps in order to get Tome to understand the way that we're doing things, but out of the box it works great.
I know I kind of asked about forms already, but any special considerations for search or views with exposed filters or anything like that?
So it seems it handles it really. So I've done a couple of them with no expectations one way or the other, and every time I've done an exposed form or exposed search for views, it's all worked great. Not had run into any issues with them.
Yeah, so you had a quick network diagram, which I couldn't.
I can go back to it if you want.
Yeah, so the question is really, are you running Tome on a separate server and production on a different instance?
Not yet.
Not yet.
It is in the works. So currently, right now, our CMS instance is actually running Tome itself, which is okay because we only really have our content editors on there, and so the level of resource usage is relatively minimal. One of the sort of longer term plans, but it requires a decent amount of like personnel resources to do, so we haven't done it yet, is to have Tome run in its own environment, so it doesn't impact CMS.
I guess what I asked the question incorrectly.
Okay.
Tome output, where does that go?
Yes, it does go to a separate environment, which we call www.
Okay.
But it's its own web server. It's still behind the same web firewall that we're using for CMS, but basically the Nginx instance on that firewall directs one way or the other depending on traffic.
And you're deploying to that through command line scripts or through the C continuous integration platform?
Both, but mostly through CCI. Yeah.
What if you have a problem, let's say like there was a big mistype or something and it was published, it really take 30 minutes to get it off?
Again, so it depends on how you have it set up. If you're using sync, if you're using the incremental module that it has built in, which we're not using, but if you are, it can be pretty fast because it'll be able to find and change small things really quickly. If you have it set up more like us, yeah, we can end up in that situation occasionally, where it can take half an hour because of the way how long it takes for a static site to generate. Where if there's something incorrect that gets fixed, it got picked up in the previous generation, and then now we have to wait half an hour for it to get fixed upstream. But one of the things that we mitigate that is that our content editors generally do their initial copy and stuff on stage, and then they port it over to prod, so they already know ahead of time, because we also have Tome running on our stage instance. And so they can see how everything's going to generate there before they just move it over. And so that's one way you can mitigate it, is sort of by training.
Can you roll back to a previous version?
Yes, absolutely. Actually really fast. It's way faster, yeah. So when we deploy from backup, it takes probably 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes at most. Yeah.
So it takes a snapshot
Yeah.
before it pushes out.
Yeah. And ours is actually might be even slower in some ways than it would be normally, because we're also capturing a lot of extra assets and stuff that Tome usually would handle itself. I think there's a hand up back here I want to capture.
Yeah. Do you run into situations where you can't use contrib modules because you're using Tome?
We haven't found one yet. I mean, that probably would happen. Well, I guess maybe, so like the whole wrong menus thing, you could make an argument that like those modules were not playing nice with Tome, which is why we're running into problems, but ultimately found a solution to make them work together. And so in some ways it's like, well, it's a matter of finding the way to make them work. But yeah, to some degree, they don't always play nice in ways that are the best.
First question is, you said there's 19,000 resulting?
Yeah, it's slightly less, but close to it.
So what if, like, have you tried this on a large site with like 100,000 nodes or more, and like,
I've not,
the time's just gonna keep getting
It will get longer and longer the bigger
as
site
you
is.
sync and okay.
Yep.
Anything special for custom modules?
As long as you take it into consideration, no. I mean, there's actually pretty decent documentation. It's not. But the guy who wrote the documentation sometimes, like, can you write in English for me? But other than that, the documentation is really, really good and robust. And so, as long as you take those things into account, you generally not have a big problem.
Part of the title said microservices, and I didn't see that like really talked about it. Just wondered,
You caught me.
what are you using that? How are you using that on the site?
Yeah, so the microservices aspect of this is mostly that we're doing a separation of powers between our CMS, between the way we're serving up our actual production environment. And that's really what I'm highlighting for microservices here. We have actually a bunch of other microservices, but they're not really pertinent to Tome. And so I had to go, as I was going through and building this presentation, some of the things that I originally thought were going to be in here ended up getting dropped. And so unfortunately, the only microservices I'm talking about is that separation in this case.
Yeah, I assumed it would be something like a form on the website that's a static website, so then it, can't post back to Drupal.
But it does, yeah, because we have it
separated.
separated.
That.
Yeah.
But like it would be something that used a third party or used an API with Drupal instead of a microservice on the website.
Yeah. Wasn't there? Sorry, my brain. We have the contact. My brain is losing this.
Yeah,
Do you know what I'm talking about? Or not? Because if you don't, it's okay. Just say no.
I probably don't know.
Okay, then unfortunately I don't have an answer.
Sure, that's fine. That's fair.
I think we are, but unfortunately I don't know. I apologize. Anyone else? I think I'm probably out of time. But thank you guys. You were great.
Nice job. Thank you.